Hey folks, welcome to Bear Mountain today. Today's a little different. We usually are doing stuff about, outside on the farm, planting flowers or starting seeds or, getting things cleaned up and ready. Today is, we're experiencing ice storm. So we last night probably got about a quarter inch of ice at our place, and walking outside is like, well, you got to have skates. So thought we'd take the opportunity just to do something a little different today. I guess maybe you could say we're working with microbiology, but what we're going to be doing today is just making a quick, easy bread. Because you know what is great on a nice day, like when you got ice and snow and all that kind of stuff, is nice fresh bread with maybe a nice soup, like a tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwiches. There's all kinds of good things that can happen here. But what I wanted to show you is just a simple recipe that I use for making, I guess you just call it simple sandwich bread. It's not Wonder Bread, not as good as the old days, where you eat that stuff and it stick right to the roof of your mouth. This is really good, wholesome bread made with good ingredients and made at home, and it's easy to make. I think a lot of people kind of steer away from making bread unless maybe they got a bread machine or they got an easy recipe where they just mix stuff up and throw it in a pot and, bake it in the oven. I've seen those things like where they use cast iron kettles. And actually, that's pretty cool. But mine's more of an old-fashioned way of doing it. You got to knead the bread, and it's not like people think when you knead bread, you just got to beat it for like 10, 15 minutes. And it's not really that at all. It's actually, and I'll show you how we do it here. It's actually a little more relaxing. And then time basically does the rest of the work. Time to let it rise, divide it up, put it in a loaf pan, let it rise again, and then bake. It's really kind of easy, but the key to success that I found with just making this simple recipe of bread is measuring your ingredients and getting the right amount of moisture into it, whether you're using milk or using water or a combination of things, and then using that nice gentle kneading process to basically stretch out the gluten and get it so it's in shape of, I guess you'd say, more elastic. Okay, so what are my basic ingredients for this? It's really pretty simple. We're going to be using a good quality flour. Now, you can use King Arthur or Bob's Red Mill, but basically what I'm looking for is something that's going to be good for making bread and not necessarily, let's put it this way, I look at the protein content. So a higher protein content, like about 11 and 12%, is going to make a very decent bread. Because you want something, that protein or the gluten, that give you the strength in the bread and the structure in the bread. If you're using something that's a flour that's maybe lower protein, but maybe better suited for pastas or making cakes or something like that, you're not going to get the structure in the bread that you'd like to get to. The other thing I do is I use a salt, Redmond real salt, in my genuine Kirkland container. But that's a nice, good mineral salt, because you're going to want to have that in the bread. That adds flavor to the bread. And then I use butter, real butter. In this case, I'm using the Kerrygold unsalted butter, some whole milk as part of it. Water is the other component. The only tools I really use for making bread is, number one thing is scale. Scale is really, really beneficial for a lot of things in the kitchen, because what's going to be important in making the bread here is the ratio of moisture to flour. And you kind of measure that in terms of percent. So whatever weight you have of the flour. And when I'm baking, I go by weight and not by volume. You can use volume. It gets you there, but you're going to be more consistent if you have weight, because sometimes volume can be influenced by, how well sifted the flour is, or just general humidity out can cause, differences in terms of volume that are more pronounced than necessarily just by weight. So what I'm looking at is I'll measure each of the components: the salt, the butter, the milk, and the water, against the weight of the flour. So if I'm starting from a base, say as an example, I'm going to make 2 loaves of bread that are going to fill a 5-inch by 9-inch, pretty deep dish bread loaf pans. So I'm going to be kneading approximately, I've got this kind of weighed down now where I'm using 1,150 grams, and I'm measuring in grams because I just find that it's a little more exact than ounces and easier to deal with. And I'm going to look at that and say, okay, I want 65%. That's the hydration level or the moisture level that I want in the flour dough mixture. And that's what you're looking for. So when you typically, like when you see a bread that has a lot of, particularly like artisan breads that have a lot of, nice airy big holes in it, that's typically an indication that the hydration level is fairly high. 65% or better will get you more stretch and more gas buildup and you'll get these when they go into the hot oven, they will get a bigger, uh, you know, I guess a better crumb is the right way of saying it. But what I'm looking for is a more uniform crumb, and I'm not making a sourdough artisan type bread here. I'm just going to be using regular yeast. So that would be like Red Star instant yeast. So I'm going to be using this, which is Red Star's active dry yeast, and that is, one way to go. I've also made this same recipe using actually my own sourdough starter too. But today I want a faster rising bread. I want to be able to get it done in the day. Typically when I make a sourdough, it's a 2-day process. And so today I'm just looking at getting some nice, easy loaves that you can use pretty much within a few hours of starting the process. And that's where we're going to start from here. I'm going to go with a base of flour of 1,150 grams, and weigh it out on my scale. And then the next thing I'll be adding, I'm going to add my dry ingredients first. So I'm going to add my salt, which would be 2%. My target when I make a loaves of bread is I want 2% salt by the weight of the flour. So what we're looking at here is approximately, I'm shooting for about 22 grams. So that's maybe a little less than 2%. So I'm going to weigh out about 22 grams of salt and add that into my flour. The fat content that I'm putting into it, you don't have to be exact as you do with the moisture. And I find with the salt, the fat content I shoot for is roughly, I guess if you look at it, is about 56 or about 60 grams, about 6%. So 6% fat. And for moisture, I'm going for 65%, which is going to be somewhere right in the neighborhood of about 748 grams. So 750, right around in that zone. So if I'm adding a mixture of milk and water, I'm going to split it between those two. So if I add and in this case with my recipe, I add 250 grams of milk, then the rest of the balance of the 750 is kind of what I'm shooting for, will be the 500 grams would be water. Okay, so we have now gone about 10 minutes after we got started on this. And what we're looking at now is we have our yeast. You can kind of see the cake. Took about 10 minutes for it to get heated up to that level. We've melted our butter. And so we're good to go there. And if you needed to, you could warm your milk up a little bit in the microwave or somewhere if we're just, to get it up to maybe 70 degrees. And then we have water that is approximately about 95 degrees. So these are the components, the wet components, so to speak, that are going to go in. Now, tools I use for mixing, to start out with, regular spoon, spatula, whatever works for you. But once I kind of have the basic moisture in, I'm going to be kind of maneuvering it around with this. It's just for lack of a better term, it's just kind of a pastry type scoop that kind of helps move things around. And this is what I'm going to be used to scraping it out of the bowl. It's kind of a pastry scraper, and then we'll put it onto the board that we're going to be used to kneading it out. Okay, the tools I use for this stage of it is I'll use this is a board or pastry scraping, for the basically so you can get things up. This is an important tool for me to use because what I don't do is I don't pre-flour my kneading board. I know a lot of people do that where they sit there and they'll go, oh, I got to put flour down. That is one of the things that people, when they make bread without, using a mixer to do the work or a bread machine to do the work, that's a mistake they make is they add more flour by continually dusting the board because they think as they're kneading and because it's sticking to the board that they got to put more flour down. Well, what that does is that changes your ratio. And what happens is instead of having it, 65% moisture, you're quickly dropping the moisture ratio down to below 60% or even into the 50s. And that will make a much more denser loaf. So the lower the hydration level you have, is you're going to get a lower rise in the bread, and you're going to get a heavier loaf that you go, it's still going to have good flavor, but it's going to be more like eating unleavened bread in some respects, because what'll happen is it'll also make it more difficult to continually stretching the gluten strands out because you keep adding new flour to it as you're doing it. So it doesn't equally get as much work out in terms of just the continual process of kneading. Now, I look at this part and I go, this is the part I kind of like because I can get my frustrations out. But basically, I'm just going to use my pastry scraper, hand scraper here, and get all of, oh, I got a little spot here. It didn't get mixed in with some flour, but that's okay. We'll get it hand worked in. I'm just going to make certain I'm going to put it on my board with no flour on it. And I know, lots of people would say, but it's going to stick. Yep, it sure is. It's also going to stick to your hands. It's going to stick until it doesn't. That's the interesting thing about it. That's how I determine when my kneading process is done. Now, it can go as long as 15 minutes, or sometimes it can be closer to between 10 and 12 minutes. What I found is it sometimes depends on the average temperature of the day and humidity and whatever. And interestingly enough, what I begin to find is that you do this more by feel than you do necessarily by the actual, specific time. So I use a one-handed technique. Other people do different things. Some people, there's all kinds of different ways of doing this. Some people just stretch it out, fold it over, stretch it out, fold it over. I tend to just like push it out and bring it back. It's just kind of a rocking motion. And it'll get on your hands. It'll get in between your fingers. But this is what this is for. If it sticks to the board, you can bring it back to center by using your scraper. And so I tend to keep my scraper in my left hand, use the right hand to just push it out. And let me just, I got this board squared away here. I just kind of push it out, bring it back, push it out and bring it back. And it's just kind of a rocking motion. And what happens after about, anywhere, like I said, between 10 and 15 minutes is you'll begin to feel like the bread feels smoother and it feels like it's almost elastic and it begins to stick hardly anything at all to the board. So it's just a matter of, continually doing it, and it looks like a globby mess and you're thinking, oh my gosh, it's ruined. And it's not really. It's very forgiving. It just needs the attention of getting it done. And so we just kind of keep going back and forth. And now when it gets stuck on the board like that up there, this is where you bring the scraper back in and you just kind of, bring it back to the center into a nice, some form of an organized, and just continue to pull it back and forth and back and forth. Okay, when you start getting near the end of it, what you're going to start to notice is that pretty quickly, the feel of the dough changes from a sticky, getting in between your hand, and you can see it's on my hand, but it's not like stuck to my hand like I'm, major gobby mess. And what you'll notice is it begins to stick to the board differently. It comes up easier. It tends to want to almost come back together a whole lot easier. And that's when you know you're getting near the end of it. So basically, you can start to do this and you'll get very little stuck to your hand. And it's getting very, very close. It just feels smooth and it feels elastic. And it's really kind of interesting. The more you do this, the more you can just determine that really you've got it activated out and you got the gluten stretched out, and it doesn't feel lumpy. It feels smooth. And when you let go of it, it tends to want to pull itself back together. It's almost like it feels elastic. And that's when you know you're near the end. And so what I do at this point is I now are going to kind of shape this into a bit of a, I guess if you want to call it, a boule or a round. And I'm just using my scraper, and as you can kind of see, it doesn't really stick to the board anymore. I mean, it's still a little sticky, but it feels right at this point that I've definitely given it enough. And I'll just do it a little faster, make sure I'm not stuck. Now I got a nice round loaf. And what I'm going to do, there's 2 tests to make certain that you know you're done. You can do what's called a window pane test. If you let this sit for about 5 minutes or so to kind of rest, it's okay to let it rest at this point. Matter of fact, it's probably pretty good for it. And then what you can do is you can pull up some, and if you can stretch it and you can get it so thin that you can almost see through it, it's got a little bit of a opaqueness to it, then you know it's ready. Or another is you can take your bread thermometer and you can stick it in. And if the temperature is somewhere between roughly 77 to 81, 82 degrees, in that zone, you'll also know that it's pretty much ready. And then why that temperature seems to be optimum, it's just kind of a bread thing. And I'm not sure exactly why. I tend to go with the window pane test more than anything else. And it's a feel. And you're just basically kind of like pinching it up. Now it naturally wants to kind of retract itself. And what I can see is just a little bit of a clearness through it, but it's still stuck together really well. So I know this is ready to go. And the next step is we go into what's called the first rise. And this is where what we're going to do is we're just going to put this into a lightly oiled or buttered bowl. And I put a saran wrap over the top, but you could use a tea towel. And you're just going to let it rise. And depending on the temperature in your room, I'm thinking between 68 and 70 degrees. It'll take, with this yeast, approximately about 2 hours, give or take, until it doubles in size. And that's kind of the key we're going to be looking for. Okay, this last part doesn't take too long. This is just basically now we're at a point, we've gone about almost 2.5 hours, a little longer than I would have thought under normal circumstances, but this is because we were a little cooler in the house than normal. The whole point is to just wait till it gets to double in size. Now, in this particular part of the phase, I will put a little flour lightly dusting on the board just to kind of prevent it from sticking too much. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be dumping this out on the board, divide it in half, and then we're going to shape our loaf. And it's really a pretty fast process. Making some noise here. Then we're going to put them in these pans here that have been buttered up. And the last step after that is we'll put it inside of a large turkey basting bag, which is just a large food grade bag that can trap in moisture and prevent the loaf from drying out. So the key to getting this out is hopefully it doesn't stick too much, but sometimes it does. And sometimes you just got to give it a little bit of a help to get the, there we go. Now she's falling out. And even though we grease this up, sometimes it still sticks. But we got it out. Okay. Now, we don't want to deflate this totally, but what I want to do is I want to divide it such that I have half and half. It doesn't matter which way I go, whether I go horizontal or vertical. I'm just going to kind of take it down the vertical side here, and I'm using my scraper here to cut it so that I kind of have equal amounts on both sides. All right, so here we go. And we move that off to the side. Now I'm going to put a little more flour down. I'm not trying to put too much down, just enough so I can keep it moving around. And I'm going to take this first piece, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of gently get it into the shape of a rectangle. And then I'm going to stretch it and fold it a third of the way, then another third, and then turn it around. And again, gently kind of push it out. Now at this point, the dough is kind of tightening up. So I'm going to pull out like I got two ears, fold them in on each other, then take my thumb and just roll it. And the whole idea is that we're rolling and stretching and rolling and stretching, roll it, stretch it. And what's left isn't the prettiest thing in the world, but what I'm going to do is just kind of stretch the skin a little bit. And then I'm going to turn it over, and the area that was the bottom backside, I'm going to pinch, pull this guy over on the end to bring it in, pinch it in again. The whole thing of what I'm doing is I'm tightening up the skin so that when it rises, it kind of keeps its shape. And I'm pinching this off where the seam was. Then we'll roll it a little bit more. Still got a little bit. Stretch it out. There we go. And the whole idea is we now have a basic loaf shape, and we'll put it in to the pan, seam side down, and that's it, ready to go.